Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Potomac River Jazz Club's monthly jazz talk. We are really excited to hear about jazz funerals and why jazz funerals are not jazz funerals with John McCusker this evening. John has spoken for us a few times, and we always enjoy your stuff, John. We really appreciate having you. A quick little reminder to leave microphones and cameras off just so we all have the widest bandwidth for the presentation and the presenter is not interrupted. And later, when we open it up for questions, you are most welcome to turn those on and fire away at the questions. Special thank you to everybody who paid for some donation tickets. Those donations help this program keep moving forward, so we truly do appreciate it. Even a dollar or two helps offset our costs, so we really appreciate that. And just a little reminder to follow us on Eventbrite and or whatever media you choose. You can check our website out at prjc.org. We're on Facebook, but we always announce what our upcoming events are. If you're in the DC area, on Sunday, we've got a great in-person concert with Craig Gildner's Blue Crescent Syncopators. And our next jazz talk, another exciting speaker on October 20th, is going to be with John Hassey doing a session on Ella Fitzgerald. So without further ado, I am going to hand over the reins to John, and we'll learn about jazz funerals tonight.
Thank you, Allie, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, good. And is my screen shared?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, we're good. So we'll jump right in here. My title is intentionally provocative because I'm sure anyone that's been around this music any period of time has said, well, jazz funeral's a jazz funeral. There's one in Live and Let Die, the James Bond film. Of course, they're jazz funerals. So it is a little bit of a wordplay, but I think after we get a little contextual history here, you'll see the thrust of the point that I'm trying to make. Now, typically when we say jazz funeral today, the way that it's been come to be celebrated today is a brass band escorts the deceased to the cemetery and they play joyful songs on the return, sad on the way there, joyful on the return. And it's become something that has become a ritual that we use to mourn musicians themselves. But that's not where the practice started. So we're going to go back to try to have an understanding of that. And along the way, get a good understanding about what was going on musically, not in the years that jazz was first coming together, but in the century preceding that. So let's start with perhaps our first important marching band leader in the city of New Orleans. And coincidentally, this gentleman was also considered a hero in this town. And he was very likely the most well-known, well-regarded Black man in the city of New Orleans, full stop, in the 19th century. And his name was Jordan B. Noble. Jordan was born into slavery, but he found himself with his owners in New Orleans during the Battle of New Orleans. And at age roughly 14, he was the drummer boy at that famous battle. After that, over the next several decades, he volunteers for every war the United States would fight, including the war with Mexico, the Seminole Wars, and the United States Civil War on both sides. He was considered very much respected man, but he started off in an era when brass instruments weren't there. And I'm surprised a lot of people, I was surprised when I learned this, and a lot of people don't know this. Modern brass instruments capable of playing the full scale of music the way that we do today is a fairly recent innovation in the history of music. Those instruments didn't come into being until the late 1820s, 1830s in France and Germany primarily. So when you're talking about marching bands prior to the 1830s, you're talking about fife and drum. And you guys are a lot closer to Colonial Williamsburg than I am. So no reminder needed for the type of music we're talking about. But in the old days, when you would serenade or play for a march in New Orleans up until the 1830s, this is what it sounded like. Okay, now that begins to change, and we get a notice about it in the 1837 Daily Picayune, which notes a mania in this town for horn and trumpet playing. The writer said you can hardly turn a corner anywhere without hearing a horn blast. This is remarkable, and what one of the conduits likely for getting these new instruments that were coming online in Europe to the New World were New Orleans' three opera companies. We had American, French, and Italian opera companies, and each one had their own respective orchestra. And these musicians, many would travel back and forth between Europe and New Orleans to go with the opera season at respective places. So they're bringing these instruments over. And it makes a rather incredible transformation in music in New Orleans. So by 1853, we're really only talking about 16 years later, there are so many brass band funerals taking place in the city of New Orleans during a yellow fever epidemic in 1853 that the newspaper feels a need to editorialize against them. The gist of the article is, hey guys, normally this is fine, but it's a little unseemly that we have all these people dying and the city sounds like a carnival every day. But what's instructive to us in ferreting out the history of the so-called jazz funeral are the description of the event offered in the newspaper account, the sound of the mournful dirge as they slowly bear their companion away, or the gay and lightsome air as they return from the grave. Sounds like a jazz funeral. But jazz will not be played in New Orleans for another 50 to 60 years. So that's our key to why a jazz funeral is not a jazz funeral. These funerals didn't grow out of the jazz tradition. Jazz, in part, grew out of the funeral tradition. And that tradition was very much in place before the Civil War was fought. Now, here's the other mind blower about this. This is almost exclusively white people. They're the ones that are holding the parades. They're the ones that are manning the brass bands. There are a few exceptions. The Société d'Économie was a Creole of color, free people of color group, and they had a few institutions. But almost exclusively, this is something that's happening among the white citizenry in this period. Well, let's flash forward 15 years. And a lot of jazz history, you'll see people shorthanding saying, and after the Civil War, and after the Civil War. But I would suggest whenever you see something say after the Civil War, it's not after the Civil War. It's after Reconstruction, or more accurately, the abandonment of Reconstruction. Keep in mind, just a little editorial notice. We defeated Germany and Japan 80 years ago, and we still have troops in those countries. But in the United States, we gave up on our own country after our Civil War after 8 years. So there's an old saying in the South that the North won the war in 1865, but the South won in 1877 when the federal troops left, Jim Crow comes down, et cetera, et cetera. As that is happening, all of the freedmen who had been enjoying the franchise, they had been able to be elected to public office, they're voting, they're involved in society, and all of that starts coming to a terrifying end. Meetings of Black leaders are set upon by mobs, there's murders, there's lynchings. So, as Reconstruction is ending, as the protection of the federal troops is leaving, we briefly had a Black lieutenant governor in Louisiana. And he suggested that the freedmen form mutual aid and benevolent societies to discuss the issues of the day and help each other out. In other words, organize. As freedmen are murdered and terrorized on the public stage, let's organize privately, was the thinking. Take care of our own and bury the dead and care for the sick. And over the next decade and a half, Black benevolent societies, based on that old world model that had always been in New Orleans, exploded on the landscape, both in the city and in the hinterlands. And along with that, the attendant brass band tradition, these funerals and parades had always been paid for by fraternal organizations. But after Reconstruction, that's when it became a staple part of Black culture in New Orleans. All right, so there's the hit song of 1898. So by the 1890s, we've got numerous African American brass bands operating in New Orleans, serving primarily benevolent, fraternal, and Masonic groups in their communities. And around this time, we start having some interesting things happen nationally with American music. One, of course, is, as we guessed from that song there, ragtime. And ragtime is immensely important to the development of jazz. It institutionalizes the second beat, syncopation, pop, pop, pop. Good lesson in syncopation, go to Preservation Hall, and half the room claps on the one and half the room claps on the two. And as sadly tragic as that is, it's instructive. It shows you that little difference that ragtime had and later jazz. That was part of its novelty, was that offset of the rhythmic emphasis. The other thing that happens around this time is we begin to have the emergence of the blues as an entertainment genre, kind of coming out of where it had been as an insular music, and it's very much on the scene. And it starts to be played by New Orleans dance bands on brass instruments for dancing. This jazz movement, this blues, ragtime will all come to influence the 20th century bands. But through most of the 20th century, here is what a New Orleans brass band would sound like. First, the dirge. These are scored pieces. It's all written out. And these musicians of this period are reading these dirges. Today, you go to a funeral and maybe they'll do like a head version of What a Friend We Have in Jesus or The Old Rugged Cross or Abide in Me. But these bands back in the day played heavy music. These were long, multi-themed pieces. They had trios in them and different resolutions and repeats. It's simply not something that you play with by ear. It is scored music. So here's an example of that. This is the West Lawn Dirge. Oops, sorry about that. Um, isn't that just gorgeous? I mean, just absolutely beautiful. And hey, Mr. Jazz, I see you. It's good to see your face, my friend, Mr. Gurrier. Um, but that's some heavy music. Now, the sort of song that would be played on the return, a joyful song. Here is an old church song called "Sing On," and this was very popular. All right, we get the idea. Now you can still encounter old style funerals, and there's still some stalwarts who are around. This is a short video of a funeral that happened in the last 3 years. This was for my friend Barry Martin at his passing, and they went old school classic with it. And you notice the slow walk, just a step and then a lean back, a step and a lean back. That's all part of the long-standing ritual of respect at the dirge part of a funeral. Well, history doesn't stand still, and time marches on, and something interesting happened as the benevolent societies began to die out really through beginning in the 30s to the 40s and 50s, and there are a lot of reasons for that. As they die out, so too do the brass bands, because the way you preserve music is having reasonable circumstances for musicians to perform. You don't keep it going by waving banners. So that gig, that solid gig from all these societies began to go away, and the number of active, fully employed brass bands with regular members, as opposed to a jump band that's just thrown together for a gig, that got small. But something remarkable happened, and we got the rumblings of this in the late 70s, and it really took off in earnest in the 80s, was a redefinition and a reimagining of what brass band music would be in New Orleans. 120 years ago, musicians combined that march perspective with blues and ragtime and came up with what we know as New Orleans jazz. Today, going back 40 years now, young people have come up and they're putting all of that into the hopper. R&B, popular music, those blues and ragtimes and syncopations as well, but it's a whole new reimagining of the brass band idiom. You certainly would have never heard the Eureka Brass Band doing a cover of the Eurythmics Sweet Dreams Are Made of This, and each generation brings their new things to it. So here's a picture from about 30 years ago, and we see a very young James Andrews in this picture. And this is all scenes over the last 30 years. So you had really the last of the old style, black hat, gold labeled, ties at funerals going on. But new generations have done things differently, and we're starting to see a little of that here. Here's the Rebirth Brass Band. These are people who are roughly my age. I'm 62. I think Kermit's maybe a year or two younger than I am. So generationally, that's where you are. And they have taken the music in a whole different direction. Here's an example of the Rebirth Brass Band. All right, so there's a little taste of that. I don't know why that cut out. Oh, sorry, I got a little jump in my thing here. All right, so here's another example. This next song was written by like a 19-year-old Kermit Ruffins, and it has now been written down, and marching bands play it, and all kinds of groups play it. And this is another fun picture. This is a young James Andrews and a young Derek Shesby here. So we're now really 40 years into this new take on brass bands. And you're really seeing all kinds of things in music in New Orleans that coexisted for over a century that are now coming together. You're hearing Mardi Gras Indian music with brass band idiom. There's just all kinds of, bending the rules or, what the norms had been. And it's very exciting. And here's another example. Here's the Little Rascals here. Oh, excuse me, the Soul Rebels here. Now, something I want to point out, and this is very tragic. You'll see over on the right there, and I know my friends from New Orleans, like Mr. Jazz, Sandy Mayo, you'll recognize that trombone player over at the right is a young Corey Henry. And what's really sad, and I've learned this in the years since, I think 3, maybe 4 of the guys in the front line to this band all died in the violence associated with New Orleans in the 1990s. Not what's going on now, but what was going on back then. So they're making this incredible music and staking out this new definition of the brass bands, all against the awfulness of what was happening with the drug war and so forth in New Orleans in that period. And at the other, say, extreme from the very old style of the early 20th century that some people practice, this is very much something that's been embraced by the bounce and the hip hop community as well. When well-known rapper Soldier Slim was shot down back in 2004. This was the turnout for the funeral. So, going over a few points that I made, and then we can open this up to question and discussion. The brass band funeral procession employing mournful and celebratory music predates jazz by 50 to 60 years. So when you think of that first happening, think of the late 1840s. Existing brass band funeral rituals and benevolent organizations were adapted and reimagined by Black New Orleans, beginning in earnest in the late 1870s, again in response to the abandonment of Reconstruction. Brass bands influenced jazz and jazz influenced brass bands, no doubt. Brass band music has been influenced by many forms, styles, and genres over the years. Dirges, hymns, and popular songs, marches, funk, R&B, hip-hop, Mardi Gras, Indian music, sacred and traditional songs. And finally, the brass bands of New Orleans of every stripe march on, and maybe you'll see one at a jazz funeral if you still want to call it that. So with that, I'd say thank you, and maybe open up our floor to discussion.
Great. I'm going to unspotlight you so we can see who's
There you go.
I can't remember. One of our previous speakers had talked about oh, it might have been Mark Bro. Anyway, that's the brass band music most certainly changes with the eras, with
Oh, yes.
influences of other songs and how I don't know. I'm not going to do his comments justice, but that they are continuing the tradition. You know that tradition moves on, but is moving on with modern elements that keep making it relevant to the younger folks as they're coming up. And
Yes, and
that
let
was
me
that
let
that really came through in what the way you presented that, I think.
thank you. And I think really it's a matter of when you say tradition, we throw that word around like, sackcloth in this town. But when you talk about tradition, it's important you talk about what tradition you're talking about. And here with brass bands, the tradition isn't the music they're playing. The tradition is the idiom of the brass band and the many different forms it's taken and the different types of music that it has embraced in different periods. So if you want to talk about the Rebirth Brass Band being part of a 150-year-old tradition, well, if you're talking about the tradition of brass bands and marching bands in New Orleans, absolutely. But when you start trying to apply genre, well, then that's a stickier wicket.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Well said. Thank you. Well said. I know we have several questions. Alexander, I think, was unmuted first.
Hi,
Hey, Sandy.
how you doing?
Good to hear your voice, my friend.
Yeah, I'll be coming your way November or so. So
Good. Sandy's one of the few people that has enough tolerance to actually play music with me on those rare occasions when I do.
always a pleasure.
What can I do for you, Sandy?
Oh, I want to thank you for sending Preservation Hall Jazz Band to Silver Spring Jazz Festival 2 weeks ago. And I'm loving your talk. I'll let you do the talk and I'll just do the listening.
Well, I'm glad that you're there, my old friend. It's
I
good to
was
hear from you.
I was very sad that they played that festival when I was in New Orleans. I'm like, where is the where is the decency? You're supposed to do that when I'm in Maryland.
That's cold.
Well, you see, yeah, that's the thing. You always want to catch the Preservation Hall band on the road because then there's usually a place to pee. And I don't know if
And
you've
they
heard, but the
play
men, I don't know if you've heard that, but of men of a certain age, that's a premium.
Good.
they play some different arrangements on the road than they play in the hall too. So
Sure.
it's interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see what we have. Michael, what you got, Michael?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for getting me in because this was the last. I'm dragging. I've been up since 4 o'clock this morning because my wife had a hip replacement, and I had to be here for John because we go back a long ways. And I'm celebrating my 50th anniversary in jazz broadcasting, and I wanted to, thank him for his contribution that he's made over the years, not only from a photographic perspective, but also from you know, a historical perspective. And I also wanted to, make a point because, I'm born and raised in New Orleans. I mean, it's in my blood. Ain't no way you can get it out.
We
In,
tried.
in fact, uh, I came up in the neighborhood that the Pope's relatives came up in the Seventh Ward, so I'm down to
Hey
the nitty
now.
gritty. I lived around the corner from Billy and Dee Dee Pierce and Saeed Frazier and what's the see that senior moment, Purple Rose of Cairo.
Hero.
I'm sorry.
Bocage, yeah.
No, no, no. That's not the name. He lived on the
Cairo.
corner
Oh,
of Gonzaga and Galvez, and he wrote the Purple Rose of Cairo. And Woody Allen did the movie and gave him credit for that. Well, anyway, I mean, that's the background that I come from. Plus, my great uncle was John Robichaux, who had the big, popularity at the turn of the century as the leader of the, Follies band. And the from my perspective, and this is something that I, physically experienced and saw how the music was evolving. The the Dirty Dozen at the Glass House was a
yes.
was a turning point in the evolution of the music because
Word.
prior to that, everything was all, as they put it in the big basket, it was traditional. But when the Dirty Dozen started doing their sessions at the Glass House, it brought contemporary tunes into that brass band sound. And I mean, that's like, from my perspective, because I'm a bebopper and I'm serious about the music, and anybody that knows me knows that I'm serious about the music. Uh, Charlie Parker used to play contemporary pop tunes in his jazz sets. And I mean, he
Yeah.
would just take the tunes that were popular in his day at his time and present them in a jazz vein. And I mean, to me, that's how that transition happened when the Dirty Dozen started putting pop tunes in a jazz, brass band presentation. And
Well,
I
I
mean,
think that's very prescient observation. And of course, you were very much on the scene in that period. And of course, you had people like Leroy, with that incredible chops and his incredible ability as a musician to reimagine what they were doing.
well, I mean, actually, I can, and who came to mind was Milton Baptiste when
Mm.
he played with what's Mr. Everything is Lovely. Mr.
Harold,
Deshawn, Harold Deshawn. That was Harold
everything's
Deshawn.
lovely.
Everything is lovely, yeah. And Milton started putting some of those licks into Harold's presentation, but then it really blew out when the Dirty Dozen started their sessions at the Glass House to, you know, combine the current music into the current, whatever was current at that particular time. And that's like I said, I can, go back and talk about bebop when Charlie Parker would play, contemporary tunes and you know, in a jazz vein. And I mean, it's the matter of presentation. You still can understand the melody and the music that they play. Oh, yeah, I know that tune, but it's being presented by a jazz artist in a different perspective.
Sure. And of course, we saw Ellis do this. He used to open with Surrey with the Fringe on top from Oklahoma, oftentimes. That was one of his favorites. But that's a really good point, Mike, and I'm so glad that you made it. The Dirty Dozen, I think, really is the fulcrum point on what came after. The real divider.
I mean, if you stand back and just look at it objectively and say, well, look, the music is going along this way, and it's like reading the EKG, there's a blip in the tracing, and they say, oh, that blip, hey, that's the rebirth, interjecting a new variation, but it's the same music. It's just that their presentation is, varied from what it had previously been heard as.
Yeah, and then of course we've got something else that's happening culturally in this period, which is particularly through the early 90s, we've got the resurgence of the social and benevolent. I mean, that's the social and pleasure club. So much so that by 1996, I think it is, we had 40 parades over the course of the year, which was more than we had had years and years and years. So the entities of the social aid and pleasure club, say, filling that role that the benevolent societies and the Masons and the Oddfellows once had as a gig, as a place for people to play.
They provided a platform for the musicians to expose the progression and development of the music, but then they also stood fast to their primary objective, because their primary objective was to bury people and take care of families after somebody had died. And that, they were perpetuating the whole system. But the music was the bedrock, because if you didn't have the concerts where the people would come and see the musicians, what they were playing, and hear it, if you came, you were supporting the overall picture of burying the dead and taking care of the families that's left after the fact. But music was the bedrock upon which all that was built.
Sure enough.
Amen. I'm gone.
Amen.
Because Ellie always say, when are you going to do something? I'm working on 3 topics. I'm working on a project called the Territorial Bands, which, most people don't know anything about. And give you a little snip. The famous drummer, Victor Lewis, who I am a big fan of, and he came to fame with his association with Woody Shaw. His folks, both his mom and dad, played in a territorial band in Oklahoma in the 40s, and that's one of the topics that I'm going to be discussing. And then I'm also working on special services bands. And a woman from Detroit, Michigan, her husband was a trombone player in the Basie band. His name was Melvin Wanzo. And, for all you old jazz fans that keep up with the music, you know who Melvin Wanzo was. Well, his wife, Carolyn, she's a retired social worker in Baltimore, but she's a very active person on the jazz scene. And she sent me a picture to highlight my second project after territorial bands, is special services bands. And that's a topic that's not discussed, people don't talk about. But I mean, everybody knows, or did they know that John Coltrane played in the Navy band? Or Bill Evans, who's the most famous alumnus of Southeastern Louisiana University over in Hammond, played in a service band for 4 years. And when he was actually going to Southeastern, he would come over and play at the strip clubs in New Orleans at night. I talked to Isaac Snookum Russell, who's a documented, individual from that period, and he knew Bill Evans when Bill Evans would come over from Southeastern and play in the clubs while he was going to school. And then my last topic is called the Jazz Ambassadors, and that was a program that was started by the State Department back in the 40s, and had Diz and Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and I mean, even to, modern times, where they had people from New Orleans that were actually jazz ambassadors to play in that program, but it was discontinued, and nobody knows about it, you know. So that's the projects that I'm working on since I've discontinued my active radio career. I said I'm going to go into a historical presentation because as I always said, when are you going to sit? I'm
I
working on
know.
it.
I'm always
Mhm.
every couple of months. I'm like, "What? You ready yet? You ready yet?"
I'm
So
working,
yeah.
but hey, like I got a setback. Like I say, my wife had a hip
Oh,
replacement
yeah.
today, and
Take care of her. Take care of
that's
her. But maybe sometime spring next year or something we can hook you up.
I'm working on it. Like I say, how many people know about the territorial bands? Benny Moten and his brother Bus over in Kansas City. Uh, they spurned Charlie Parker and
Basie and all
yeah,
that.
all of the people. I got a really nice picture of Jay McShann. I used to run with Jay McShann on numerous concerts, and his daughter used to work for Jazz Times magazine, you know. And I'm talking to Bobby Watson about, contact to get some more information on the territorial bands. And like I said, the special services bands, all of the people. I mean, there's dozens of jazz musicians who use the service as a stepping stone to further their career. They were able to go to school and get advanced educational degrees as a result of the GI Bill. And then the third one is the special, the jazz ambassadors. I'm not trying to take over. Hey,
Yeah, we'll
it's
get some
good to
other.
see you, man. I'm just adding
It's
stuff.
good to see you,
And
Kat.
thank you for
And
allowing me that platform to, expose the information to people because if they don't hear about it, they don't know about it and they can't appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah,
well,
we
it's
look
good
forward
to
to that.
it's good to hear your voice and know my people are still good. We all went to the winds 20 years ago, so it's always still good to know
Hey,
good people are still around.
So
Katrina might have washed me out, but it didn't knock out nothing from my head, and I'm still out here preaching the gospel of jazz. Amen.
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 Good. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. We're going to get to one of the questions from the chat, and then I know Joel Albert's also been waiting. So, Brian Alpert wrote, "Were the white hats a response to the more traditional black hats? Like, if were the black
Good
hats seen
question.
as old school and the white hats new school, or what happened with
Well,
that?"
actually, it's a moving target. You know, up until say the 70s and so forth, it was de rigueur that you wore a white hat at a parade, which people today call second lines. I hate that. It's a parade. And you'd wear a black hat for the funeral. Now, it didn't mean that the musician had to buy two hats. If you bought the full ensemble with the white hat, it came with the black, like a rain thing that you put around it, and that would make your white hat a black cap. But that was very much that, having the full uniform. I mean, if you showed up for Percy Humphrey's Eureka Brass Band and your shoes weren't shined, you didn't have your tie on and your coat, you're going home. Just full stop.
Yep.
That's the way that used to work. Now, you go to a parade and, three trombone players will just show up and march with the band. That would not have happened back in the day, partially because of the union, but partially because the leaders weren't going to put up with it.
Thank you, Joel. You're up next.
Uh, yeah. You mentioned Eureka as a trendsetter, and I didn't catch whether you meant contemporaneously or they were at some point the trendsetter. Is there a band that's the trendsetter today?
Well, I don't know if I would say trendsetter. I would think more, the word I would pick would be emblematic, representative of what the band sounded like there. Now, the Eureka was very polished. Percy Humphrey, the leader, his grandfather had been teaching people up and down the river to play music. He was a trained musician. So they were, very tight. today, not so much. And most arrangements that you're going to hear with a marching brass band in New Orleans are head arrangements. There's no music, there's not going to be a lot of changes in the song. You might sit on one chord for measures upon measure. That's the same chord all the way through. So you're just dancing around either on the triads of that or, or whatever you got going on with that scale in there. So it's very different than, say, a ragtime where you've got all those changes and all those melodic innovations. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Did I press a button?
I'm doing that.
There we are.
Yeah.
I was interested to see the shot of Treme. You had a shot in your presentation of Treme with Benny Jones on bass drum.
Yes.
And it used to be Uncle Lionel Batiste.
Yes, indeed.
On bass drum with all his jewelry. And Benny on snare drum. And I had the good fortune 15 years ago to be marching with those guys at jazz camp. And I never did that before. It was my first time. And
Great,
I asked,
right?
yeah, and there was Uncle Lionel. But I turned to Benny and I said, "How do you play this music? Teach me." And he says, "Oh, you just play it. That's it. just play it."
I saw Mr. Benny 2 weeks ago, and I told him that I had just shared on Instagram, and I told him what I was going to do. I shot pictures of the band 2 weeks ago, and I had just gone through some of my old negatives from the 90s, and I had a shot of him with Tuba Fats, when that was the band back then, and they were marching. It must have been like 95 or something like that. He was playing snare then. And it was just really nice to see him. Benny looks good. I told him he looks good, man. You're aging much better than most of us.
He's an old buzzard and still going strong.
All?
He's carrying that bass drum. But that Treme band that you showed was not the Treme band of maybe 10 years ago or 12 years ago.
No, it's not.
And so I was interested to hear you talk about how the style is updated. While there are certain firm traditions that you observe in New Orleans clubs and music and the old timers, the music is never the same. And I think that is great. That is great.
Well, it shows you, again, talking about the idea of tradition and continuity, talking about the brass bands being the idiom that is the tradition, the brass band itself. So too, the thought process. The thought process of 120 years ago of taking the popular music, ragtime, blues, and playing that in a wind band ensemble for dancing, that's the same thing they're doing today. It's just what's going into the hopper is different. And of course, what comes out afterwards is different. But that process, that's the tradition. It's not one particular music or another. It's that all of this goes in. And this is one of the things we always talk about in New Orleans. We do not have, and I know anybody that's ever played music in New Orleans or been around it can say this, we do not have a music industry in New Orleans. There is no music industry. In our municipal government, there is no one in charge of overseeing our cultural economy in any meaningful way.
Is that good?
Well, that's a matter of debate. But here's the thing. The thing about it is, I don't know what I do again. My cat just stepped on my keyboard. Sorry about that. Tuki, get down.
I meant to say, is that bad?
Rejigger me here. I have to put my cat down. Is what bad?
Is the fact that there is no central cultural thing, is that bad?
Here's the thing. There's no continuity. Like you'll hear problems about, the parades and the police protection and so forth. For years, there was no communication between the people holding the parades and the police department. Same thing with the Indians. Well, one of the things that kind of came out of post-Katrina New Orleans was this group started talking to each other. So, you don't, I mean, and people that witnessed it can talk about this. 30 years ago, if you tried to go to a brass band parade in Central City or downtown, you had police there on horseback like it was a plantation. You see what I'm saying? The cops weren't there as part of it. They weren't there feeling like they were, protecting and serving. It was this very onerous presence on horseback. And there are just so many creepy antecedents in Southern history regarding that. And someone finally had the eureka and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that. Things as small as that. So that has happened. But is there a noise ordinance or a dB ordinance that's enforced anywhere in this city? No. And it's not because we don't want it. But the thing is the majority of the people that own the property and run the French Quarter are not New Orleanians. I mean, it's comparable to what you have going on in Florence, Italy, or Venice. We are completely bought out. And, we can try to get reform or get public services in our parts of the city. But, the French Quarter, it is all Wild West. You are never going to have a cop go into a bar on Bourbon Street and say you're playing too loud. But, you have a brass band go through your neighborhood and, it's going to be Karen to the fourth. There's going to be people calling the cops left and right. So there's no policy.
Thanks.
Coming into another question, I'm going to read it as it's written from the chat. I'm curious about the relationship between the second lines of dancers in parades and brass band funerals. Did brass band funeral parades also have dancers?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, let me point out, since we're talking about language and particularly calling something a jazz funeral as opposed to a brass band funeral, I don't use the term second line, and there are a number of reasons for it. One is 30 years ago when I was learning from 70 and 80-year-old men, they despised the term second line. And here's why. One, it's idiotic. It's like calling an automobile a steering wheel. The second line is part of the whole. It is not the thing itself. They said a parade is a parade, a funeral is a funeral. And back then in the 90s, when there was a lot of bad stuff going on, gunshots and so forth at the parades, those old men, I remember, there was this man, Ghost Eli. We were at this bar down on Washington Avenue. And he said, the problem with this tradition is the second line. Wow. So in other words, saying that the problems that they have and the things that people associate with the second lines aren't the organization putting the parade on. It's not the band. It's the people that come and follow. And I was in the second line following parades in the 90s, and the gunshots would ring out. And for years, I kind of had a rule. I would stay with the parade till the first rest stop. And after that, everybody's in their cups. People are in a different state of mind. You got the endorphins going, or some New Orleanians would say endolphins. And it's bad stuff could happen back then. And, it's not like that now. It's it's been very chill. We had one yesterday. It was just lovely. But the term second line has come to be used to talk about the whole tradition. And you'll hear people saying, oh, is there going to be a funeral second line? That just is fingers on a chalkboard to me to hear that. One other thing. You start seeing the term second line showing up in print. I think one of the earliest places I see it is maybe in an interview in the 40s or something. There was a term around the turn of the century along the river that sounds a lot like second lining, but it's a racial pejorative expression. I won't repeat it, but it sounds a lot like second line. So on the outside chance that the term second line came from that expression, I also avoid using it.
Thank you. Damien also, he said amending his question to change second line to just non-funeral parades, and Damien,
Yeah. Oh, well,
there are a lot of different kinds of parades. There the parades that are uh, uh, centered around the carnival season and around specific things. People pay to be in those parades and distribute throws and perform. And those kinds of parades, you wouldn't just have people jump in. You might have dance teams or dance crews, but they're not the kind of parades necessarily that you'd have a bunch of people jump in afterwards and dancing with you. But there are smaller ones. You have a parade after a wedding, John, right? Like where a brass band is playing,
yeah,
and
and
people would jump in with that and dance.
right, and certainly you've got the stuff that's actually grassroots and going on in the community. And people do confuse this with Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is an entirely separate thing. It's insular, it's sealed, it's in one season. A brass band parade can really happen at any time in New Orleans. You can encounter them anywhere. Now, of course, it is an affectation now, so every bridezilla wants a parade.
Yep.
And why shouldn't white middle America get an opportunity to come try to feel down home for a little while? It's a commodification that we have, and it keeps keeps money in a lot of musicians' pockets. So, it's easy to kind of poo-poo it, but it's a staple gig and it keeps musicians going.
There's just a whole bunch of commentary in the chat.
John, you ignorant slut.
I love it. I brought up Dick Hyman. I think is who Michael you might have been trying to come up with the Purple Rose of Cairo, and then somebody sort of replied. Jane replied to that. Small World Connections. Dick Hyman's daughter Judy. This is a little bit fragmented. Accomplished. Along with husband Jeff, the old time music scene, and worked with her dad. So just some commentary and stuff in there. If there are any other,
it
yeah.
was.
Oh, can't hear you, Michael. You're muted.
Mr. Piron is the one that wrote that tune, The Purple Rose of Cairo.
Yes.
And he lived around the corner from me on the corner of Gonzaga and Galvez, right across the street from my barber.
Yes.
But he was a very popular musician. And that's another area of discussion that nobody ever talks about. All of the lakefront boroughs. They had the West End, Spanish Fort, Millenburg, Little Woods, all of these little villas that were upon the south shore of Lake Pontchartrain that were very popular during the turn of the century when the brass band was in its heyday. They used to have these cutting sessions. They had these pontoons. They would drive piles into the lake, put the planks on top of them, and build clubs on the end, and they'd have cutting sessions at the back end of those, clubs and all that. The hurricanes wiped them out, and nobody even talks about them. but Mr. Piron was one of the band leaders that had bands in that location during that time. And that was, you know, it brings to mind about the hassle that I had. People say that when Storyville closed, jazz died. But hey,
Yeah.
jazz was always going on in New Orleans. I mean, you had jazz developing in the Tango Belt, and then those 5 boroughs along the South Shore Lake Pontchartrain were just breeding grounds
Well,
for continued music, you know, elevation and perpetuation.
well, Michael, the ABC connect the dots history of jazz that unfortunately still has some legs under it among tour guides and lesser educators. The idea that, jazz was born in Storyville, and when it closed, there was an exodus of musicians and so
No,
forth. It's all balderdash. It's
no.
complete nonsense. And really, what's even more offensive about that story is it supposes that an artificially created, segregated red light district for white people is what birthed black culture.
John, Storyville was an area of prostitution that used to be over on the riverfront, but it got into a hassle with the people because the French Market was a Walt Disney location. Families would go down to the French Quarter to avail themselves of all of the things that the French Market
Yeah,
used to have
Gallatin
available,
Street. At
you know.
Gallatin Street.
But
Yeah.
then and when I used to do tour guiding, I would ask people, I said, what you think a sailor wants to do the first time he hits land after he's been on sea for a whole bunch of time? And that's to go out and have some time with a lady or whatever you want to call it. Well, that whole strip was located just adjacent to the French Quarter, so there was a confusion because the families wanted to go down into the French market to avail themselves of what was available in the French market, but they had to contend with all of the riffraff, the drunk sailors, the prostitutes, the con men, and all of the other hassle. And that's how Storyville evolved. They pushed it all the way back on the back side of town on the other side of the New Basin Canal. And it was named after Edmund Story, who was the city councilman that,
Sydney.
you
Sydney
know,
Story.
yeah, Sydney
Yeah.
Story that had the transfer occur. And then it got
Well,
close.
it was very much in line with 19th century social engineering thought at the time. And it's also a very sort of Protestant point of view as opposed to the Catholic point of view, which is how our century started in the 19th century. The idea of taking all of this bad and putting it in one place where it can be controlled, regulated, and all that was the bill of goods they sold.
Sold, yeah.
Yeah. But just the whole idea, and the fact is, people like Louis Armstrong didn't help with this because Louis Armstrong didn't know what Storyville was. I mean, the people there called it the district. His mom was in prostitution, and Franklin Street extended from the white, the
That was
white.
on the other side of Canal Street.
Yeah, let me finish if you may. There was Franklin runs all the way back then through the district below Canal Street to the uptown side, the street that used to come through and run right up to where City Hall is now. That was South Franklin Street, and North Franklin was on the other side of Canal. Well, Lewis grew up at South Franklin at Perdido, and that was the Black Vice district. And you crossed a canal, and then you had the Storyville district that was there, and he saw it all as one big thing. As sort of the whole big one thing. There's a famous conversation that Lewis is having with Al Rose, and as many things as you could disagree with Al Rose about. Lewis is saying, "Yeah, I was in Storyville." And he's like, "Lewis, you were Perdido and Franklin. Storyville ends at Iberville Street on the other side of the canal." And he goes, "Really? I didn't know that." So one thing about one wonderful thing about Lewis is he's a typical Louisiana storyteller. He doesn't necessarily let a fact or a fine detail get in the way of telling a good story, So, if you could drop Storyville in there, it makes for a good story. But the
it's just
fact is, as Mike was pointing out, there were more music gigs at any particular weekend out at the lakefront at, both, not only at the resorts, but also at the camps. That's where sort of the hoi polloi and mix of people had these camps out over the lake bottoms. And it was squatting, really. If you could build a camp and a dock out to it, it was a lake bottom and you could have it. And that ended in the 30s when they built our flood protection system. But, the Storyville, you've heard it here. I'll just tell you, the Storyville is mythology. Leave it, it's best left alone.
Well, it was an area of prostitution, and it wasn't an area of music preservation, perpetuation, and movement. So, that really leave it go.
It wasn't Lincoln Center.
No, that's for you're or the Kennedy Center nowadays.
Oh.
Oh, don't go there, baby. Don't go there. Oh no,
Don't make me
please.
sad tonight, y'all. Don't make me sad tonight.
Yeah, don't make me sad tonight.
Any other questions? I want to make sure anybody who wants to ask gets a chance to do that. Anybody else have, you can either unmute or last call to type it up into the chat.
But since nobody's saying anything, I gotta say something, because the topic that you very rarely hear people say anything about it. But in the period where Storyville was being closed by the Navy Department because of STDs and the soldiers coming into New Orleans and then going overseas and being carriers, the point that needs to be brought up, there was an area in near French Quarter, and I'll say near French Quarter, as Rampart and Canal Street, and it was called a Tango Belt.
Mm-hmm.
And you very rarely hear people talking about the Tango Belt. And it was named after the Latin American music that came over. I mean, if you want to say it was part of the Spanish change, that's your prerogative. But that area was a hotbed of music. The original Dixieland Jazz Band played in that area. My great uncle's John Robichaux played at the Folly Theater, which was also in that area. And I mean, they got stories about they had the white people wanted to see the music that was being played in the black clubs, and they would have presentations after hours because of the segregation. But the Tango Belt is an area in New Orleans that has gotten very little exposure. A lot of people don't know anything about it. And then secondly, like I said, those 5 boroughs on the South Shore of Lake Pontchartrain. And
well, maybe we'll do a presentation on that sometime.
As John, as you mentioned, from Little Woods in the east all the way to the West End, and they had Millenburg, Spanish Fort, and all of these little villas that had these clubs, spas, and there was a lot of music out there, but nobody says anything about it. Amen.
Well, you said about 20 minutes about it tonight, my baby.
Well, hey, that's my call.
I know, man, and you're right.
Add it to your list. So I have a couple more things in the chat, but one is a question: what influence did the early bands, early XX century, I don't know, I'm assuming 19th century bands, receive from the Caribbean? Talking about Haiti and Cuba.
This is a good question. This is a good question. All right. First of all, you can't talk about things being all one way or the other. But we have to be very careful about modern takes on things that seek to project back. All right. What we have is what we have in terms of the record. And what we know is we had a high regard in the city for music formalism. In other words, regardless of what paint job you were, as Danny Barker used to say, what represented musicianship was that old model. You know, black, white, whatever. If you went and studied with old man Tio in Seventh Ward, if you went and studied
she came out all right.
With those people,
say a prayer for her. I'm on a Zoom.
Sorry, I think I forgot my thought. What were we talking about again?
If you didn't study with the old
right, yeah,
masters,
it was musical
right?
formalism.
Yeah.
You know, I actually, in the Ory collection that I donated to Historic New Orleans collection, they had Papa Tio's method book that he taught out of, that he presumably taught Johnny Dodds, Sidney Bechet, all those guys out of. And it's a classic European method book. You know, you start in C, add a flat, add a sharp, add another flat, add another sharp, and you learn the scales. You know, and that was the point of view. And you know, old man Tio said that he would run in the house and close the door if he heard some ratty brass band coming down the street, because he was a musical formalist. So the challenges that you had to musical formalism were the people like Buddy Bolden. They did not come up saying, oh, you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way, you have to read the dots. They broke the rules. They played it their own way. They played by ear. And when you play music by ear, it's not necessarily going to be better or worse, but it's different. It's a different experience to play that way than it is to play from the dots. So you've got that blowing up. In part, that's what the jazz movement does, in terms of ensemble musicians and so forth. You know, I know in some of the jazz histories, they'll make a big deal about, you know, because white folks always do this. They want to like divide black folks into different categories, you know. But really what it came down to was this was the new style that everybody followed after a certain point. You know, you'll read about, oh, the Creoles didn't like this, but really anyone, regardless of their flavor or culture, born after 1885, whether they were born in Treme, you know, the Eighth Ward, or whether they're born back of town or Central City, they all have the same music framework by then. You know, Bechet isn't banking on that. Freddie Keppert isn't banking on that. They're playing the hot new music. You know, so musically in that school. And then, of course, following that, you have someone like Kid Ory who bridges both those worlds. Ory has fakers and hot players in his band, but he always has one good reader. He always has, you know, typically in New Orleans, it was always one of those Creoles, you know, either a Bagard, you know, or who was one of the other guys, Big Eye Lewis Nelson, one of those guys that knew how to read. So if a new piece of music came in, they could handle it. So that's what I think of as the idea of blowing up the musical formalism. Because before jazz, the music that people most associated with New Orleans, opera.
Opera. I was going to guess opera.
And talking about our friend Dick Hyman, you know, Dick Hyman very astutely points out that if you take the Habanera from Carmen and listen to it a few times, and then you listen to the first movement of the Crave by Jelly Roll Morton, you can see exactly what's going on. So we're talking about a Spanish tinge. We're talking about a Spanish tinge that came from a French composer.
Well, I like to say about, you know, Duke Ellington's term, you know, because he's the one that, from my perspective, coined that term Spanish tinge, you know. And when you look at it overall, I bring in, again, my great uncle, John Robichaud, who had a band, and his band members went down to Cuba with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Now, during that particular time, people of African-American heritage were not up on the front lines. They were in the back. They were commissary men or dealing with supplies and stuff like that.
So it was the
like
Ninth Colored Infantry that went. Ninth
like
Colored Infantry with the Onward Brass Band.
like I put perspective, the wall was where Marsan Airport was, but they were bivouacked out in New Orleans East. So they were out in New Orleans East where the local Spanish people lived, and there was an interaction between those people and John Robichaux's band members, and there was a interchanging of licks, and they got New Orleans licks, and the people from New Orleans got some Afro-Cuban licks, and that's how it's all in the recipe as the development of the music evolves. And I mean that's another point that people don't there's nothing said about that. But American jazz musicians went down as part of Teddy Roosevelt's aggregation, and they interacted with the musicians there. They shared New Orleans licks, they got Afro-Cuban licks, and the music played on.
Well, that's a way of looking at it. Now, I would note that the New Orleans musicians who made up that band with the Ninth Colored Infantry that went in after, as you correctly pointed out, after the battle had happened, after the fighting and the war was over, but they ended up being an occupying force. And there's a picture of the band in a book that was done by the chaplain of that unit when they went to Cuba in the summer of 1898. I would take issue with describing anyone as a jazz musician in 1898. And I would point out that in my research, they weren't bivouacked in New Orleans East; they were bivouacked at the fairgrounds. And
Okay,
famously, whoa, let me finish.
Yeah.
Famously, when the day that they marched and left to get on a ship to go to Cuba, they marched down Esplanade from the fairgrounds. And it was page one of every newspaper in the city because it was like the biggest turnout day for Black New Orleans that anybody could remember. And they referred to the parade route all the way from the fairgrounds to the Governor Nichols Street wharf as being, quote, a sea of Senegambians. So
Well,
it was a very, very big day.
I appreciate you sharing that information with me because, and when I said that, when they were bivouacked in Cuba, it was like the wall was where Marsan Airport was, but they were camped when they were in Cuba itself. They were camped out there in New Orleans East, and I mean, I was just doing that as an example of, they were away from the
they were
actual
actually,
out
they
the
were actually in
battlefield
Santiago.
site.
Yeah, they were actually but I will point out, to your point, they were in one of the places that's considered one of the musical parts of Cuba, Santiago.
Right.
The south side.
But I appreciate you, sharing that information with me because I had never heard that point before where
there's I did an article on it, Mike, for the Centennial, and it's in the Jazz Archivist newsletter.
Okay, from out of Tulane.
1998, and it's online. Yeah, it's online, and I think you'd like it. And I was able to find the name of every New Orleans musician that went on that trip.
Well, don't start me, because then I'll say, well, hey, what about all of the musicians that were behind the American lines at Chalmette when Jackson was,
we covered that.
Pakenham,
We covered that. We talked about Jordan Noble.
Yeah, we're over time now, y'all. We're over time.
All right. Hey, y'all, thank you. Thank you again for inviting me to be part of it. I enjoy talking to your group.
We always love having you, John. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah. And thanks everybody for attending. And again, check us out online. We've got John Hesse next month in October. And if you're in the DC area, several live events coming up. And we hope to see you again in the future. And I know I will invite John back at another point, and hopefully we'll get Michael in here too sometime soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.